My brother-in-law leaned in and whispered, "Sign over your inheritance, or I'll tell your husband about your past." I simply smiled, pulled out my phone, and said, "Then listen to this." The confidence drained from his face before the recording had even reached the first sentence. We stood in the corner of my late grandmother's living room while relatives argued over tea, legal papers, and memories that suddenly had price tags. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows. Inside, the scent of old wood, and Jasmine couldn't hide the bitterness gathering in the room. His hand still rested on the inheritance documents, waiting for my signature. Mine rested lightly on my phone. He had spent months pretending to be the family's peacemaker, offering advice, carrying boxes, comforting everyone after the funeral. No one noticed how every kind gesture quietly positioned him closer to my grandmother's estate. Then he decided fear would finish what manipulation had started. "My husband deserves to know who you really were before you met him," he whispered, smiling as though we were sharing a harmless joke. "One message from me, and your perfect life disappears." For a heartbeat, I heard nothing except the ticking grandfather clock behind us. He thought my silence meant surrender. He mistook composure for weakness. He didn't realize that people who survive their past stop fearing it. They learn to prepare. They learn to wait. And sometimes they learn to press record. I unlocked my screen without saying another word. "Then," I said quietly, meeting his eyes as I tapped play, "listen to this." The color left his face so quickly it was almost frightening. In that single moment, I knew the conversation had stopped being his trap. It had become mine. People often mistake quiet women for easy targets. I've spent most of my life letting them believe that, because correcting them rarely changes anything until the truth reveals itself. My name is Elena, and I married my husband Daniel 8 years ago after spending most of my 20s rebuilding a life I almost lost. Before I met him, I escaped an abusive engagement that left behind rumors far more stubborn than bruises. I never lied about that chapter, but I never volunteered every painful detail either. Daniel knew enough to love me without demanding that I relive the worst days of my life. His older sister was married to Victor, the man now standing across from me with inheritance papers in his hand. From the day we met, Victor carried himself like someone who believed every room naturally belonged to him. He complimented people only when it earned him influence, and every favor he offered came with invisible strings that tightened months later. After my grandmother passed away, she surprised everyone by leaving me the family home and the surrounding land. She had raised me after my parents died, believing that steady character mattered more than loud ambition. The will wasn't generous because I needed saving. It was her final vote of confidence in the person she knew I had become. Victor never accepted that decision. To him, I was the quiet outsider who had somehow received what he thought should have been negotiated, manipulated, or claimed by someone stronger. Every family gathering became another subtle interrogation. He asked careless questions about my finances, hinted that maintaining the property would be overwhelming, and repeatedly suggested I sell before life became complicated. Most people dismissed his comments as concern. I recognized them as rehearsals. Men like Victor rarely begin with threats. They begin by testing boundaries, measuring silence, and convincing themselves that kindness is the same thing as weakness. He wasn't the first person to underestimate me. He was simply the first one arrogant, enough to do it while I was already collecting the evidence that would eventually undo him. The weeks after my grandmother's funeral settled into an uneasy routine. Every visit to the house seemed to include Victor, though no one could explain why he was always there before everyone else arrived. He wandered through the rooms with practiced familiarity, running his fingertips across antique furniture and framed photographs as if he were already deciding what belonged where. His comments were never openly offensive. They were polished enough to pass for conversation, but each one landed exactly where he intended. "An old place like this is expensive to keep," he'd say while studying the cracked windows. Then his eyes would drift toward me for just a second too long. It's a shame when sentiment becomes a financial burden. Around the dinner table, he praised Daniel for being practical, then laughed softly before adding, "Good thing someone in the marriage knows how to make difficult decisions." Everyone chuckled politely. Daniel barely noticed. I simply folded my napkin and continued eating, refusing to reward the remark with a reaction. Victor seemed fascinated by silence. Whenever I declined to argue, he'd tilt his head slightly, watching me with the patient curiosity of someone waiting for a crack to appear. He mistook restraint for uncertainty. Then there were the little things no one else seemed to notice. Documents left slightly out of place after he'd offered to organize them. Locked drawers that somehow weren't locked anymore. Questions about my grandmother's lawyer disguised as casual curiosity. Each incident was too small to accuse him over. Yet together they formed a pattern that lingered in my mind long after everyone had gone home. One evening, as I carried empty teacups into the kitchen, I caught Victor standing alone in the hallway outside my grandmother's study. He wasn't looking at the books or the photographs. He was staring at the small fireproof safe hidden behind the writing desk. When he realized I was watching, he smiled with effortless calm. "Just admiring the craftsmanship," he said. It was the brief pause before he spoke, not the words themselves, that convinced me he had already begun planning something far bigger than casual manipulation. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic confession or a spectacular mistake. It came through a habit Victor couldn't control, his certainty that no one paid attention to the quiet person in the room. A week before the family gathered to finalize the estate paperwork, he asked if we could meet privately to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. We sat in a small cafe across from the courthouse. Sunlight spilled through the windows, and the soft clatter of coffee cups covered the spaces between our words. He didn't waste time. "If you sign the property over now," he said, sliding a prepared document across the table, "everyone walks away happy." I looked at the paper but didn't touch it. "And if I don't?" He smiled, not warmly, but with the confidence of someone revealing his strongest card. "I'll tell Daniel everything about your past. People forgive a lot until they hear the story from someone else." For a moment, I simply watched him. He had built his entire strategy around a secret that wasn't even a secret. Daniel already knew about my broken engagement, the police reports, the nights I spent hiding at my grandmother's house. We'd cried over those memories years ago. Victor had mistaken old gossip for hidden shame. That realization changed everything. Without interrupting him, I reached into my bag and pressed the record button on my phone before setting it face down beside my coffee. He kept talking, calmly explaining how a signed document would make his problem disappear. He believed he was negotiating. He was documenting his own blackmail. When I left the cafe, I wasn't angry anymore. The fear he'd counted on had quietly dissolved, replaced by something steadier. For the first time since my grandmother died, I knew I wasn't waiting for Victor to make his next move. I already had it. I resisted the temptation to confront Victor immediately. People like him rarely collapse under accusation alone. They retreat, deny, and reshape the story until the victim sounds unreasonable. If I wanted the truth to survive, it needed to be stronger than his confidence. The morning after our meeting, I scheduled an appointment with the attorney handling my grandmother's estate. I played the recording from beginning to end without interrupting it. He listened quietly, then removed his glasses and explained, in the same measured tone he used for every legal matter, that any further communication with Victor should be documented. Every text, every email, every unexpected visit could help establish a clear pattern of coercion if the situation escalated. That advice suited me perfectly. I stopped taking phone calls and replied only in writing. When Victor insisted on discussing family business in person, I answered that all decisions regarding the estate would go through my attorney. His messages became noticeably sharper, though he was careful never to repeat his threat directly. He underestimated something else. Daniel and I had always shared passwords, calendars, and difficult conversations. There was no secret corner of my life waiting to be exposed. One quiet evening, I sat beside him on the porch, handed him my phone, and let him hear the recording himself. He listened without speaking, his expression growing still rather than angry. When it ended, he looked at me instead of the screen. "You were never hiding your past," he said. He was counting on me not knowing it. That single sentence erased the last advantage Victor believed he held. From that day forward, every family meeting followed the same simple rule. My lawyer attended whenever paperwork was involved. Copies of every document were reviewed before anyone signed them. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors now unfolded in rooms full of witnesses. Victor had wanted privacy. Instead, I gave him transparency. It was remarkable how cautious he became once he realized every move he made could be remembered by someone other than himself. The final estate meeting took place in the same living room where my grandmother had taught me to play chess as a child. The board still rested on the bookshelf behind her favorite chair, a quiet reminder that patience often defeats speed. Everyone arrived expecting signatures. Victor arrived expecting surrender. The documents were arranged neatly across the dining table, My attorney reviewed each page with calm precision while relatives exchanged polite conversation over untouched cups of coffee. The room felt almost ordinary, which made what followed even more unsettling. Victor leaned toward me just enough to keep his voice from carrying. "So," he murmured, "have you made the sensible decision?" I met his eyes, unlocked my phone, and pressed play. His own voice drifted across the table. "Sign the property over now." Then came the sentence he believed would never be heard by anyone else. "I'll tell Daniel everything about your past." The room became impossibly still. No one interrupted the recording. No one rushed to fill the silence after it ended. Even the ticking clock seemed louder than before. Victor's confident posture slowly unraveled. His shoulders stiffened, his hand withdrew from the papers, and the practiced smile he'd worn for months disappeared without ceremony. Before he could explain, Daniel spoke in the same calm voice I'd fallen in love with years earlier. "I already knew her past," he said. "What I didn't know was yours." There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations. My attorney quietly slid a folder across the table containing printed copies of Victor's recent messages, organized by date alongside notes documenting every attempt to pressure me outside. The legal process. One by one, the relatives read through them. No speeches were necessary. The image Victor had carefully built over years didn't collapse because I destroyed it. It collapsed because for the first time, everyone was looking at the same evidence I had quietly collected all along. He had come expecting my signature. Instead, he left carrying the weight of his own words. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no divided camps arguing late into the night. Instead, something far more lasting settled over the family. Trust shifted. Relatives who had once brushed aside Victor's helpful advice began replaying old conversations in their minds. Small moments they had ignored suddenly fit together. Loans offered with hidden expectations. Decisions gently steered in his favor. Favors that never seemed free. They weren't discovering a different man. They were finally seeing the one who had always been there. My sister-in-law faced the hardest truth of all. She wasn't responsible for her husband's choices, but she could no longer pretend they were misunderstandings. Watching her accept that reality was painful, and I never celebrated it. Revenge had never been about humiliating innocent people. It had been about ending a pattern before it reached someone else. Daniel and I grew closer in the silence that followed. The recording hadn't strengthened our marriage because it exposed Victor. It strengthened it because it reminded us that honesty, shared years earlier in the privacy of our home, could withstand someone else's attempt to weaponize it. As for the inheritance, the estate was settled exactly as my grandmother intended. The house remained in my care, not as a prize I had fought to win, but as a promise I had kept. Every time I unlocked the front door, I remembered her quiet belief that character reveals itself over time, not through grand speeches. Looking back, I realized Victor's greatest mistake wasn't trying to blackmail me. It was assuming my past was something I wanted to bury. The truth is, surviving it had already taught me the lesson that ultimately defeated him. Fear is loud, but evidence is patient. And patience, when paired with integrity, has a way of speaking so clearly that no lie can drown it out. Months have passed since that afternoon, and the house has found its rhythm again. The legal papers are filed away. The furniture sits where my grandmother left it, and the silence that once carried tension now feels like peace. Every morning, I open the kitchen windows and let fresh air drift through, rooms that no longer feel weighed down by suspicion. Victor faded from our lives in the most ordinary way possible. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls became infrequent, then disappeared altogether. Reputation, I learned, is rarely destroyed in a single moment. More often, it erodes quietly when people begin trusting actions more than appearances. I don't think about revenge anymore. I think about freedom. For years, I believed surviving my past meant protecting it from the world. Now I understand that healing isn't measured by how well you hide your scars, but by how impossible they become to use against you. The truth I once feared had become the very thing that made Blackmail powerless. Daniel still catches me smiling whenever I walk through my grandmother's garden. He says the house reminds him of me, steady, unassuming, and stronger than it first appears. I always laugh, because she would have liked that comparison far more than I do. Sometimes neighbors ask how I managed to keep the property when so many families fall apart over inheritances. I simply tell them that documents matter. Honesty matters, and patience matters even more. Most battles are not won by speaking first. They are won by knowing when the truth is finally ready to speak for itself. If there's one lesson this chapter left me, it's this. Never underestimate someone who has already survived the worst day of their life. They don't need revenge to feel whole. They only need the courage to stand still while the truth catches up. In the end, I never defeated Victor with anger. I defeated him by refusing to let fear write the final chapter of my story.